Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Ruling on the Field podcast. I'm Seth Mendelson. Alongside me is my brother, Sam Mendelson, and we're going to get right into some breaking news. The Carolina Panthers officially announced that they are firing head coach Frank Reich 11 games after they brought him in. He really only had an 11-game tenure with this organization. Now, everything is going wrong for Carolina right now. You went all in on moving up to the first overall pick, bringing in Bryce Young, expecting him to be your franchise quarterback, and you actually regress as a team this year compared to where you were last season. Sam, let's get your thoughts here because, I have a lot to say seeing as he was my former head coach, being a Colts fan last year, but I want to pass it over to you first because just seeing the bombshell that is Carolina Panthers organization right now, do you have any, glimmer of hope that maybe it just seemed like this was inevitable?
I mean, it's tough when the owner steps in and takes the quarterback that he wants. And there was video that surfaced from Draft Combine after the Panthers had traded up for that first pick with him talking with CJ Stroud about how impressed he was with him and ended up taking Bryce Young. And now we're seeing what CJ Stroud is doing with the Houston Texans, and the Carolina Panthers are now on the books for two head coaches for the next 3 to 4 years in Matt Rule and Frank Reich. And this is a team that, again, nearly made the playoffs last year with interim head coach Steve Wilks, who's now the defensive coordinator in San Fran, and they didn't give him a shot, and they went with Frank Reich. And I think it's just, it's a shame to see Frank Reich go through what he's going through, because we saw the success he had in Philadelphia as the offensive coordinator. And you and I had talked about this. There are some coaches who are meant to be coordinators and some that are meant to be head coaches. Some people can't make that gap. Clearly, a guy like Mike McDaniel, who's worked his way up from like tight ends room to quarterbacks room to running back room to receivers room to offensive coordinator to now head coach, is a perfect example. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about the Miami Dolphins and the hard knocks and all the amazing things that are coming out of the Dolphins the Dolphins camp. But with the Carolina Panthers, they have went through 9 quarterbacks over the last few years. Sam Darnold, Baker Mayfield, they brought back Cam Newton, and the list goes on. And you feel for Bryce Young because they gave up so much. They gave up his best weapon, and we saw what DJ Moore did against Minnesota. We've seen him in prime time having over 100-yard game, 200-yard game, and when you give up your best weapon, and again, no slouch to Adam Thielen, who we all kind of maybe laughed and mocked at in the first week or two, he's been exceptional, but they don't really have a lot of great pieces of around Bryce Young, so I don't necessarily put this on Bryce Young, but this is 2 years where Frank Reich has got fired from 2 different organizations. And I think the Carolina Panthers probably shouldn't have went with a guy like Frank Reich, who's just coming off, getting fired. I think you can make the argument that if a guy's getting fired from one organization, he's not ready to go back into a different situation. But I do think that, to your point, Carolina right now, everything is a mess. They've given up a lot of draft capital. So when a coach is looking to come in, or whatever head coach they interview in the offseason, they don't have a lot of pieces around Bryce Young. Maybe the coach doesn't even like Bryce Young. And now they've lost draft capital. Again, Chicago not only has their first from last year, but they got their first from this year, which is currently the number 1 overall pick. They added a second in the draft from that the Chicago Bears took last year, and they gave up DJ Moore. So there's not a lot of appealing things, and there's this rumor that the Patriots are maybe looking at getting rid of Bill Belichick and that the Panthers have been eyeing him. I don't think Bill Belichick wants to go from the second worst or third worst team in the league to the worst team in the league. So it's really a shit show in Carolina.
Yeah, it definitely is. I do disagree with you with the original hire of Frank Reich and the statement that you made that if he got fired from Indianapolis, he maybe wasn't ready to be a head coach. I do think what he did in Indianapolis, like you have to also understand, he was working with a lot of different quarterbacks. That offense looked amazing with him and Andrew Luck. The 1 year Andrew Luck, one comeback player of the year, and had his best season as a quarterback in that offense. And then he brought in Phillip Rivers. They're still able to make the playoffs. You brought in Carson Wentz. That you were a game away from the playoffs. You brought in Matt Ryan. He was faced with so much adversity in that situation. It almost seems like Frank Reich has never been able to mold the quarterback that he so desperately has wanted or needed in his offense. But the reality is the NFL is a business. We talk about this in our podcast frequently. And as the owner, you have trump card. You have final say in who you want to run your team, who you think is the best product or asset. And if the owner fell in love with Bryce Young, there's no changing his mind. And if you can't make that work, he'll bring someone else who can. And clearly for him, money was no object. He realized that Frank Reich was not able to make Bryce Young the quarterback or the product in a business term the way that he envisioned it. So he's got rid of him, board ship, and hoping to bring in a change of pace, a fresh look. And look, the reality is Carolina, again, a game away from making the playoffs last year to now what would have been the first overall pick, but they don't have that pick. And it just looks really bad on this organization that, ever since Cam Newton just took him to the Super Bowl and there was so much hype and excitement, they just haven't really been able to make anything kind of or taste any success. And so it seems like they, in terms of all the organizations right now, I mean, you probably put them in the same conversation with New England Patriots in terms of like they have a lot of shit to figure out, like a lot of shit there.
Well, and the one other point I'll make with Frank Reich is, he brought in his guy in Carson Wentz to Indianapolis, and it was a failed experiment. And he did put his job on the line with Carson Wentz's future. And they gave up a lot, Indy, to get him. What was that they gave him, Washington?
It was a second round pick. It was a conditional pick, but it turned into a second because of how many.
But it could have been a first. It could have had conditions to be a first that just never amount. I think if they made the playoffs or if you play a certain amount of games.
Yeah.
And it was a failed experiment in Indianapolis. And then in Carolina, there was just so much back and forth of him giving up play calling duties and not doing that. I mean, we look at some of the offensive head coaches in the league, like a Mike McDaniel, an Andy Reid. I mean, they've taken the play calling and they are the ones who make. Mike McCarthy took it from Kellen Moore and they let Kellen Moore go in Dallas. So those coaches who are offensive minded, I rarely ever see them give up their offensive play calling. We've seen Brandon Staley. We talked about him last week after his heated press conference saying he's not giving up the defensive play callings. And then you're Frank Reich and you're supposed to be a leader of men. And we know we've seen a little bit of him in Hard Knocks when the Colts had it. It almost reminded me of Draft Day a little bit, when in the movie where the owners, they get first and they want Bo Callahan, and then they're all Kevin Costner's characters like
all their picks for him,
and that's what they wanted. And the owner wanted Bo Callahan, and in this case, the owner wanted Bryce Young. But clearly, and this is going to be the stat that's going to maybe be the crazy one of this podcast is the quarterbacks with more wins than rookie quarterbacks that have more wins than Bryce Young are Anthony Richardson, who hasn't played since week 4, week 5.
And Will Levis, full game.
Will Levis didn't start the season, and Tommy DeVito all have more wins than Bryce Young. And obviously CJ Stroud, but we're talking about like the names of guys who haven't even started or who've been hurt for so long. They haven't won a game on the road. They won one game at home. And you just look at what the Panthers have, and they do have some pieces defensively, but offensively, and like I said earlier, they just don't have what's around him. And when the owner's saying, no, we're going with this guy, and all these videos now come out with Frank Reich, it's like you almost feel like the burden was on Frank Reich to just mold Bryce Young, and he just wasn't able to do that. And because of that, the owner's like, well, I'm sticking with Bryce Young. We just paid so much capital to get him. The easiest decision for him to go. And now that is 2 head coaches that have been fired. And according to Adam Schefter on Monday Night Countdown before the game, there's a potential 7 to 10 spots available next year. So I know we'll save that for another podcast, Seth, but I want to get into the Indianapolis Colts, Frank Reich's former team, removed former team, because it's not now his former team. That would be the Panthers, but the Indianapolis Colts and Gardner Minshew. We just talked about Anthony Richardson, excitable quarterback. He has more wins than Bryce Young, but hasn't played in so long. There were some questions about what could Gardner Minshew really do. He came in, to Baltimore and was able to win. Baltimore's the top team in the AFC. I mean, that's they're a team that finds crazy wins. They beat Mahomes at home last year. I mean, they went into Baltimore in a rainy Maryland game, and they able to upset them in overtime. Michael Pittman with a crazy catch where he lost his helmet. But the Colts, Seth, after the Thanksgiving, are in a playoff spot. The Buffalo Bills aren't, and we'll talk about them in a second. But Seth, I need to ask you, as a Colts fan, what have you seen about the Colts, a team that released Shaq Leonard, who's now visiting the Dallas Cowboys and the Philadelphia Eagles and the Minnesota Vikings this week? But the Colts are in a playoff spot as of today, in a wild card spot, the number 7 seed. Are you just surprised? Do you expect this? What are your thoughts?
I'm just letting this all sink in. I just really enjoyed hearing you praise the Indianapolis Colts that way. I was just sitting here smiling, being like, yes, he's right. Everything he's saying, this is wonderful. Look, the reality is what I've always felt with this Indianapolis team in the past 3 years is they have a lot of talent around a lot of different places, and finding that, person we're talking about leader of men who can bring it together. We did see it with Frank Reich 2 years ago, where there was 9 Pro Bowl players on the Indianapolis Colts roster that year. So there's a lot of talent on this team. There's also a lot of holes on this team. And I'm not going to sit here and say that I believe that Indianapolis Colts are a Super Bowl contending team this season, but they are a competitive team with pretty much any team they play with or play against. And what I've loved just watching, now bringing in Jonathan Taylor back has really just evolved this offensive scheme. You have 2 incredible running backs that in a lot of ways do similar things. They both can block in the backfield. They both can go for, catch it in the backfield, and they both can make these, big runs, break these tackles, and they're both able to get over 40, 50 yards a game. And so you've created this, or you've resurfaced this identity of being this run dominant team, this strong run team, which is always, it doesn't matter what defense you are. If you're going up against a tough team that can run the ball and run, consistently down your throat, it opens holes. And what we're seeing is Michael Pittman starting to get, all of these plays really shining in a wide receiver one. Michael Pittman has played with a different quarterback every year in his career, and he's had almost 1,000 yards every year in his career. That is a very, very, impactful stat in terms of what they have in Michael Pittman. You now bring in the talent of these young receivers of Josh Downs, who I love what I've seen from this kid. He makes, these highly contesting catches, but he's also just so shifty as a slot. Alec Pierce is really kind of plateaued a little bit from where he was in first year, but he makes these big catches. Like, you have a lot of talent in that offense. But what I love the most is that the offense works so soundly with what Shane Steichen's vision is. And there was a specific play in this last game against Tampa Bay. I watch every game being a fan. They are an aggressive team. When it comes to fourth downs, I think we're starting to see a pattern. When you have an offensive-minded head coach, you're more likely to go for these fourth downs when you're maybe in your own 40 or you're kind of in that midfield. There was a play. It was so well executed. It was 4th and 3. It was on the 50 or so, and it was Gardner Minshew running a run pass option, an RPO, and he faked it to JT. Everyone convolved in the middle, and he just threw a little seam pass to Mo Alley Cox, and he ran for 30 yards. It is little things like that when you see something run so or executed so executed to perfection, it just shows you that this team's buying in, this offense is clicking, and that's, we're only talking about one side of the ball. On the other side of the ball, and again, I could probably go all episode on my excitement for the Colts right now.
Yeah, let's reel it in a little bit. Come on.
Well, I just want to talk about how the defensive line has really stepped up. Players like Daya Adeyungbo, Samson Ebukam, who they brought in. These guys are bringing in pressure. So when you can bring in pressure on quarterbacks and you can run the ball effectively, you're seeing this 6-5, wild card contending Indianapolis Colts team, who, when you look at the rest of their schedule, they have some big games coming up against Pittsburgh and Houston that if they win both those games can really solidify their spot. So I think there's a lot of excitement in Indianapolis this whole year. I was just excited to see what Anthony Richardson could do. And when he was done for the season, you had a lot of belief in Gardner Minshew being a winning quarterback. But the way that he's been able to really, cement himself into this role and step in has been great to see. And I do think Indianapolis is going to be a threat to teams like, Pittsburgh and Cleveland, who are right in front of them, to even step up a few spots. So, I appreciate you giving me the floor to talk about my Indianapolis Colts. Again, I think this is going to be a really fun team to watch as the season progresses. You've got, 2 more games against Tennessee, one coming up next week. So there's a lot of really big games and big moments for Indianapolis that we'll keep talking about. But
sorry, Seth, I just need to chime in because I have a point on the Colts I wanted to say as well. And they already played the Titans. They played
more praise.
Well, look, we just talked about Frank Reich and the head coach. This is the second head coach if you take away the Jeff Saturday experiment, but this is the second head coach that they brought in from Philadelphia as an offensive coordinator. One is clearly a leader of men, Shane Steichen, who I think we can talk about being in the coach of the year conversation. But this is a Colts team that when you look at the rest of the schedule, they've got at Tennessee, Will Levis, at Cincinnati without Joe Burrow, so it's Jake Browning, home to the Steelers, where you rather play the Steelers at home than on the road because it's very tough to play in Pittsburgh, at Atlanta, at home to Vegas with Aiden O'Connell, and then what could be the final game of this year, like the Sunday nighter in Week 18, is the Colts home to Houston. I mean, that is a potential one with those two teams and the trajectory. And you look at what the Colts schedule is, they came in with the third easiest strength of schedule in the NFL. So there was opportunities for them to succeed. But you look at some of the games, I mentioned the Ravens one, they should have beaten the Browns. The rest threw that game. Week 1 against the Jaguars, they had that game and then kind of fell apart in the fourth. So I won't give them that one. But you look at what their schedule is, they came back from 23-0 down against the Rams, went to overtime, nearly won that game. I mean, there's a good chance that this team could have been 8-3 and up there with Jacksonville on top of the AFC South. But when you look at their schedule and you see what they have, and you've got backup quarterback, a team that for the first time outgained their opponent in the Pittsburgh Steelers, and then Desmond Ridder, I honestly think he is a backup quarterback, another backup quarterback in CJ Stroud. There is a huge stretch of games here where if the Colts go 4-1, 3-2, or even sweep all 5, they will be in the playoffs. And, a lot of things could happen in the playoffs, but there's a good chance that it could be a matchup of week, 1 and week 6 against Jacksonville. It could be one of those matchups again. So I think the Colts have it pretty lined up in a good way where they're going up against backup quarterbacks, very winnable games, and the games that are tougher on the road aren't against the toughest opponents in Tennessee and Cincinnati with backup quarterbacks coming in. So I think it's really set up well for Indianapolis. I just wanted to bring that point up as well.
No, you're absolutely right. I appreciate you correcting me. I thought we had 2 against Tennessee, but
they beat them at home.
Right. It's just been, a season where a lot of people have stepped up. And, you messaged me when they cut Shaq Leonard. And this was a guy, like, you have to understand, like, for 4 or 5 years, I watched him just make play after play and just be in awe, thinking, we had the next, like, Luke Kuechly. And I do think that was very much the trajectory of his career until he suffered some pretty significant injuries. But other people stepped up. Zaire Franklin, I'm pretty sure, is still the leader of tackles in the whole league right now. EJ Speeds looked great. They just had a guy, Ronnie Harrison, who stepped up and had a big interception last game. Like, they've had people step into these roles, and maybe that's because they've experienced so much turnover and injuries that they've had to be adaptable. And, it's been very exciting to watch it and as a fan and see this team week in and week out being able to put up points. Jonathan Taylor looking like it's great to have him back. He's looking like he's becoming vintage Taylor that we saw, in an MVP race 2 years ago. So there's a lot of excitement there, and I'm going to hold my breath because there's still, it's not easy to win games. You mentioned we're going up against backup quarterbacks. Sometimes they can have great games as we've seen already this year, but let's talk about the game of definitely the week. Might be the game of the season, Sam. Philadelphia Buffalo, another team trying to make a push for that wild card spot. A team in the Buffalo Bills that we thought were going to be, in the top conversations as they have been in the past few years with the Kansas City and Jacksonville, but have had, a pretty tumultuous season. And you go into Philadelphia, going in, and we talked about how big this game was and the impact it could have on their season had they got the victory. And they had every chance to win that game. Now, again, we're talking about one of the biggest, most clutch kicks I've seen in a long time, with Jake Elliott hitting a 59-yard field goal to send it to overtime at the end of this game. But there was, it just goes to show you in football, you can play such an effective game. You can be so efficient, Josh Allen. He was doing it on the ground. He was doing it in the air. He was making plays. He was running. He looked probably the best Josh Allen I've seen all season in the rain, in the Philadelphia Eagles kingdom, or Eagles den, as they say. And one or two mistakes was all it took for Jalen Hurts to see a little window and take advantage of it and force it to overtime. And it's starting to make me question Josh Allen. Yes, you put him into this elite conversation in terms of talent and skill ability. What he did even in that game, very few quarterbacks in the NFL can do or have ever been able to do. But when it comes to these big games and these moments where you expect this elite quarterback to get that victory, time and time again, it seemed like the Buffalo Bills fall short. And I don't know if this is now being a part of their identity. Maybe they come out of this bye week, they feel some, momentum, realizing that they're able to play with the Eagles and go to overtime. And, these are now, I think it's 3 or 4 games that they've now lost where they were leading, and then with like a few seconds left, and then the other team came back and they found some, unfortunate, miserable way to lose. But all in all, this game was incredible. It's just, again, Bills are part of this incredible game with a sour taste, and how you try and find that silver lining time and time again is just, as a Bills fan and Bills Mafia, it's just hard to swallow.
Yeah, not sure if that's the term you want to use for that. I go ahead. The big things for me is the Bills at Josh Allen are 0-6 in overtime games. And that is, a couple of them against Mahomes and all this stuff, but that is obviously a very indicative stat of the Bills coming up short in a lot of cases. This was a game, though, I think the Bills almost had to win, but I don't think it was, as much as I want to say it was a must win, I think it was a really good showing for the Bills. I mean, Josh Allen, we were talking about him earlier in the year about how his struggles offensively were being a catalyst for a lot of the Bills' problems. And then defensively, they started dropping like flies in Tremaine Edwards and Matt Milano. And you can't keep saying those guys because they're not coming back. They're not coming through the door. Leonard Floyd's having a really Pro Bowl year for sure that no one's really talking about. Von Miller, I really haven't seen much from him. They played a lot of off coverage against that Eagles. And when you're up by 10 points twice against this team, who, let's for all sakes and purposes, is the top team in the NFL, they're a championship-built team. You can't give them life. And Josh Allen made one mistake in terms of that interception that was unlikely, but he balled out. Like, he was not the reason they lost this game. I mean, Sean McDermott, similar to Brandon Staley, he's the defensive coordinator and the head coach, and they're just, I guess you could say there's just not a lot of meat on the bone, in the sense that there's just not a lot of players that are able to step up. I know they brought in Rasul Douglas, but he's not going to make or break that defense. They did a good job in limiting A.J. Brown, but DeAndre Swift had a day. Jalen Hurts had a day. In terms of the biggest kick, it was definitely the biggest kick this year. To me, and again, I'd probably say it's maybe a little bit harder because it's in the rain and the weather and it was outdoors, but the 66-yard game-winning field goal that Justin Tucker hit against Detroit.
Well, that was history.
That was also in the dome, like a controlled environment. You can't control all that stuff. And the Kelly Green and then Jake Elliott be like, this is my place, this is my place. I think this was more, I came away from them saying the Bills are getting back to the Buffalo way, and they do have a chance to make a run, right? It's not an easy schedule. We went through it last week. You said that they were going to go 5-2. Now those 2 games are gone. There's 5 games left coming off a bye week. they've got to figure stuff out. I mean, there was a couple key plays in that overtime. Jordan Davis, the 300-pound defensive tackle, was logged, according to Next Gen Stats, as the second fastest speed ever by a 300-plus pound defensive lineman. And you're like, oh, well, why are you bringing this up, Sam? Josh Allen was forced to go out of bounds where he could have got first down. He could have got more yards on a few plays later on that specific drive, obviously in overtime, but on that set after getting the first down. When you stop Josh Allen and it makes it, second and third, and they have this play where Gabe Davis, who got a game ball 2 weeks ago for getting 0 catches because he's an unselfish receiver, which I think should go for saying in a world of divas. We've seen Antonio Brown coming on a hot air balloon, and everything about guys holding out. Gabe Davis is okay not getting any receptions, and he got a game ball because they trust him in Buffalo, and he did everything else well. He did it for his blocking, he did it for his route running, but the route that he messed up on was a play where they went all out blitz for Philadelphia, and you had Diggs going kind of to an out route where if Gabe Davis didn't come off his route and went more to the post, that's a touchdown, and the game's over. We're talking about Buffalo having 2 straight wins against 2 good defenses in the Jets and Phillies, and that's just football for you. When the ball went back to Philadelphia, I personally believe that unless there was a play that there was a fumble or missed snap, that the Eagles were going to come down and either tie the game or win it. And there was a very, very small instance of a play where the ball was caught by A.J. Brown and he fumbled it. They didn't rule it a catch. You could make the argument that it was a catch. I think it was the right call, but it did look like he almost had 2 feet. But as soon as he got a second foot down, the ball came out. But to me, this was a Jalen Hurts game. I mean, he struggled for the first half and then willed his team back in the second half. Couple rushing touchdowns, couple receiving touchdowns. And you just got to give kudos to Philadelphia for what they were able to do against a Buffalo team who was playing desperate, and they saw it. They had 500 yards of offense, so the Eagles are going, okay, now we got to play San Fran and Dallas. Both teams are rolling, and how are we going to, control the things defensively? Because right now that's, I think, their biggest Achilles heel is their defense. But offensively, they're still rolling, and they still got things. And even without Lane Johnson, they were able to get almost 4 or 5 yards per rush.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is just a bigger, point and statement on Jalen Hurts being able to lead this team in big moments, right? Like in the biggest moments, we're seeing the best version of Jalen Hurts.
He's got to be the MVP frontrunner, right?
I think without a doubt, especially just how this Eagles team has been steamrolling. And look, there can be a lot of critics who are like, oh, Jalen Hurts has, he's got the best, line in front of him. He's got the best weapons and he's got a great defense. But you still have to you're still a guy who's getting that ball and making those decisions and making those moves and extending those plays. And, I think if and when he does win the MVP, there should be a definitely some type of nod or credit to Jason Kelce, especially what he's been doing these last 2 games. We're talking about some of the best, blocking that I've seen from any lineman, but especially a center, how he's able to, we're seeing a center pull and getting to that second level and opening these holes. And it's just been incredible to watch a guy, if you watch the documentary, the Kelce documentary, was, thinking about retiring, and probably if they had won last year, he would have, but he's still at the best of his game. He's probably playing his best football and is probably the best, arguably, lineman in the game right now. Definitely the best at his position. But you can definitely make that argument. And looking on the other side of the ball, though, going back to the Bills, after this bye week, it's not easy for them. They got in Kansas City and then home to Dallas as their next 2 games, and their season is on the line in those 2 games. Yeah. So you get this week of rest to really try and hone in, figure it out, get the boys rallying together. But, it only gets harder from here, and they've put themselves against the wall that they are desperately trying to climb out of, because if this team doesn't make the playoffs, it's going to be a lot of lengthy conversations in the offseason. Could be another coach on the hot seat if and when that happens.
And the team that the Bills are trying to catch in the AFC East, if they can even catch them, is the Miami Dolphins, which I think went down. We talked about this on the podcast, some of the great plays. I think arguably we saw obviously with Justin Jefferson and the Bills last year, that was the play of the year without a doubt on that 4th and 15, 4th and 17, the one-handed grab. In terms of like maybe the craziest play I've ever seen in my life. I mean, the butt fumbles up there. There's a few that are up there, but the reverse Hail Mary. I can't call it the fail Mary because that happened in that Seattle Green Bay game where they had backup refs and one went touchdown and the other one was going touchback. You know what I mean? And so I call it the reverse Hail Mary, but to throw a Hail Mary at halftime, which we see countless amount of times where things are like, you know what, who knows? We could get a touchdown. Like, what can happen? To get it returned over 99 yards, and I believe I told you the stat that there was a New York retailer TV says if there was a play over 98 yards that they'd give over $1 million of televisions, and there was a 99-yard INT return. The Dolphins seem to have everything going. Seth, you and I actually watched together the Hard Knocks first episode of the Miami Dolphins. I was just blown away by so many things, and we could talk a whole other episode about the stuff that was going in the basketball court in their team meeting room. But they have something going with Mike McDaniel, Tyreek Hill. Maybe Tyreek Hill is the best offensive weapon. Maybe that's a little foreshadowing to what our 2-minute warning is. We'll get to that in a second. But the Dolphins, I mean, we talked about Shane Steichen. We've had this conversation off air about maybe Mike McDaniel deserves to be the coach of the year. Jalen Ramsey, a couple weeks ago, having a huge game against the Raiders, 2 interceptions. We saw that on Hard Knocks. They just actually signed Jason Pierre-Paul. He's going to be coming in for the Jalen Phillips injury. Unfortunately, he tore his ACL in MetLife, which, again, another conversation for another day. But now that's 2, almost 3 injuries of torn ACLs on that field. So I honestly think it's the worst field. And I used to say it was in Washington, but the pebbles just don't come up. But the Dolphins continue to roll. They still haven't beat anyone significant. I mean, they have the Cowboys coming up at home as well down the road. But how much do you just say that for a team like the Dolphins, and we mentioned kind of with the Colts, you have to win what's on your schedule. It doesn't matter if you're going up against bad teams or good teams. I mean, their 70 burger against Denver all of a sudden looks like not only was it incredible when it happened, but now with Denver winning 5 in a row and that looking like a lot of an easy win back in the day, Denver's really turned it around. Maybe they just got them at the right time, but what can you say about what the Dolphins are doing, what Mike McDaniels has done there in Miami, and ultimately, when you look at the weapons around them, Tua and Raheem Mostert, Devon Achane still out, when you look at the top 4 or 5 fastest players, or 4 or 5 top fastest plays in the league, according to Next Gen Sports, they're all Miami Dolphins. 3 of them, I think, are Tyreek Hill, and then the other are Devon Achane and Raheem Mostert. So they're a team that's built on speed. They've got some good weapons defensively with Bradley Chubb, Jalen Ramsey, Xavier Howard there in the backfield. What can you say about the Dolphins? And did you learn anything maybe from Hard Knocks about this team's identity, that it doesn't matter if they beat weaker teams, that they could make a deep run in the playoffs?
Yeah, I mean, the best thing about Hard Knocks is that it allows you, whether you're a fan of the team or just a fan of football, it allows you to peel back the curtain and see the culture of an organization, because this is, it's a business. This is like, you think about when you're going into an office and you think about successful businesses, it all stems from that culture, that belief, that leadership that is able to inspire and rally people. Like yes, we obviously put talented players on pedestals, and when we see Mahomes and Kelsey raise the Lombardi, we're like, these guys are the best at their position. Of course they would win. But there's so much behind the scenes and so many different layers to this. And that's what's so amazing about Hard Knocks. And, every team has their own stories and their own culture. But we've known, even prior to that first episode of Hard Knocks being released, in-season Hard Knocks for the Miami Dolphins, that there was something special about Miami this year with what they were able to do, with the speed, the excitement, that any play can go for a touchdown, that they are these big, they're like these big booming plays that can constantly happen at any moment of that game. And we've seen it time and time again. And what I've just really, really enjoyed in that first episode, and I think we kind of already had a bit of a sense of it prior to this show. Now we even understand it more. It is Mike McDaniel, who you're talking about, conversations for Coach of the Year candidate. I don't know how you don't put him at the top of that list with Dan Campbell as like 118. That's kind of where I view it currently. And, he has built so much trust with his team. He also just loves the game. Like, he has been around the game his whole life. We saw the story about him, being the Denver ball boy or ball carrier, trying to, work for that organization because he loved them growing up, doesn't get that job, ends up in Miami. And he just seems to be the perfect persona for South Beach. Like, he just has the swagger. He's got this like demeanor. Even the small conversations of him and Tua, like the excitement that he has in certain places. He's like, I thought you were going here, but you were going there. And you see the boys just like get to him at his level and he gets to them at their level. And that's what's been so amazing about this Miami Dolphins team, that, sometimes when you're talking about divas in the NFL, sometimes when you have so many talented players, you could start, seeing some cracks in the ship, some holes in the ship, but we haven't seen that with the Dolphins this year. And I think that's a testament to Mike McDaniel being the perfect person to lead this, greatest show on surf, as we're calling it. And, I just think there's a lot of fun. It's very exciting. I'm personally very excited to continue watching these episodes alongside you. I guess I'm just curious, you brought up the reverse Hail Mary. At what point does Javon Holland realize that it must be right when he crosses that end zone that he's getting a cake?
Well, yeah, one of the things that we saw in the Hard Knocks is it's a good point. He's probably thinking not end zone touchdown.
As he's running, he's like,
hey.
Yeah.
And that was something that, if you haven't seen the episode of Hard Knocks, there's a thing that they've been doing for their defensive players all year where they make a big play, they actually get them a cake, and on the cake, on the front of it, is the photo or the play that they did. So I want to be him crossing the end zone or for him making the interception. It was one of the most bizarre plays I've ever seen it. And with the Dolphins, that it seems like everything seems to be going their way. Unlike the New York Jets, who again lost Aaron Rodgers at the beginning of the year, I think it's over. Like, I think that had they put out an effort against the Dolphins, maybe there was a little bit of hope. They probably should have been in the game against the Las Vegas Raiders. Seth, I mean, my answer is no. But does it make any sense for Aaron Rodgers to come back? Again, it would be the quickest recovery from an Achilles injury. He still wants say, okay, here's Aaron Rodgers. We have a legitimate chance. If he comes back by Christmas, which again is 2-3 weeks away, or there's maybe a chance where they can squeak in, but they're dropping games. I mean, they didn't even look to Zach Wilson. I think his career in New York is over. I think we could have said that last year, but you look at what he has, and he's not even the backup. We talked about that last week. They're going with Tim Boyle again, and they've got Atlanta coming up, and then they've got CJ Stroud. And then I'll just tell you quickly who else they have. But it doesn't even really matter. I think it just, they're 4-7. There's so many teams ahead of them that are playing better. Houston, if Miami, Buffalo gets things going well, Indianapolis, Cleveland, Baltimore, I don't know why I said Baltimore, they're going to make the playoffs, but Pittsburgh, there's so many teams ahead of them. Denver. I look at their schedule, and they got Washington, they've got New England left, but they still got Houston and Miami. It just doesn't make sense for me or for Rodgers to come back, even though he keeps thinking like that.
Yeah, I don't think if he comes back, it's with the intention of trying to make a playoff push. I think that's pretty much written for the New York Jets 2023 season. I think it's more of and it might be an ego thing, and I don't really think he's an egotistical person from what we saw from Hard Knocks, and if you watch him on Pat McAfee, but he definitely has this competitive spirit. It's the proving it to himself that he can return in that time and wanting to see what the offense could look like with him at the helm. Like, I think it's more of those types of, this is a guy who's a very spiritual person, very, existential kind of thought process. I think he's not thinking about the future. He's thinking about the present. And if he can play, he will play. I think it's as simple as that. I don't think it has as much, or there is as much tied to it for a playoff run as we might think it should be. I think he has his own personal desires and interests to get onto that field. But yeah, you mentioned it, going back with Tim Boyle. I don't know if what they saw from Tim Boyle was even better than Zach Wilson. I just don't think, they have a quarterback right now who can win them games. And unfortunately, when that happens, you start seeing, we're talking about, those cracks in the armor with the Dolphins. With the Jets, we're seeing it all over the place. This was a defense that I thought, going into the year was top 5, and they haven't been able to really live up to that, even with all the talent that they have there. Breece Hall and Garrett Wilson are two of the more up and coming young talents, but there's like, who's getting the ball to them, right? So it's just, the unfortunate reality if you're a New York Jets fan. And I think it's just, we'll leave it at that. But I do think if Aaron Rodgers does decide to play, it's not because he's expecting to try and push them for a playoff. It's more of his own personal agenda and chapter being like, I set myself on this goal to come back. I feel like I can do it. I want to do it.
No, and that's a very good point, and we'll wait and see. But you talked about cracks in a defense, and I want to talk about one team who's shown a little bit more cracks, and there's maybe a bit more holes on their defense in the Detroit Lions. There were 3 games on Thanksgiving. We did this podcast last week before the Thanksgiving games. Dallas, San Fran, they rolled. We'll actually talk about Dallas and Seattle in just a moment. But the Detroit Lions, Seth, their team, you just mentioned you have Dan Campbell as your 1-1A head coach of the year. I honestly think if the Colts make a change, Steichen creeps into that conversation. Maybe he's the third option. But Dan Campbell and Detroit people had them being a better team this year. They obviously opened up the NFL season in Kansas City because the NFL wanted to showcase the Lions being good. They laid an egg, in my opinion, on Thanksgiving. But the more concerning point is they've given up an average of 29 points on defense over the last 5 games. And you look at those offenses that they're going to have to face in the playoffs: Philadelphia, San Fran, Dallas. How worried should you be if you're a Lions fan? Offensively, they still have some nice pieces, and they're still being able to move the ball down the field. But defensively, I mean, we saw Aiden Hutchinson. He could not get to the quarterback, and Jordan Love's opened the game with a bomb to Christian Watson. And it seemed like whatever Jordan Love wanted, he got. And they're going to go up against a lot harder quarterbacks in the playoffs. How concerned are you about the Lions and their defense right now?
I think there's definitely a good and fair reason to be concerned, because I think when you went into the season as a Detroit Lions fan, your goal and expectation was to win the division. And I do think that is still very much on the card. And I do very much think it's almost, I'm not going to say it's set in stone. You never know what could happen. But there's a good word for you. But as the season continued and progressed, you're just like, we're not only going to win this division, we're Super Bowl contenders. You started having those thoughts for the first time in I don't know how long as a Detroit Lions fan. And I think this was the first game where you saw, we talked about the cracks in the armor, where you're like, I don't know if we're a Super Bowl contender anymore. Like, we'll get a home playoff game and we can win and be competitive, but there is still a lot that needs to be figured out in that secondary specifically. They're giving up a lot of points. They have the ability to score a lot of points. They have, I think, the best running back. I know I talked about the Indianapolis Colts, but I do think the Detroit Lions currently have the best running back duo in David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs. And I do think Amon-Ra St. Brown, we talked about him. I put him in my elite conversation of wide receivers. There's a lot of talent in this team that allows them to put up a lot of points and allows them to be, competitive and a scary team to go up against in the playoffs. We just talked a lot about the Eagles. The Cowboys have looked, a certain type of way this season that's pretty, nerve-wracking if you're Detroit. San Fran as well. So when I think about the NFC, juggernauts, and those top three, or those three teams I mentioned, or I put at the top three, there was a moment throughout the year where I was like, Detroit is right there with them. That game, I was just like, maybe there's a bit more of a gap than I thought.
Yeah, and you were talking last week about, the NFC playoff picture is pretty much set. Well, Minnesota loses at home to Chicago, and Seattle loses at home to San Fran. And all of a sudden, you see Green Bay win and the Rams win. Even New Orleans, they're all a game back of the final two wildcard spots. I think if Dallas wins against Seattle, we're pretty much locked in the 5 seed at the very least, which means they're going to some team in the NFC South. But the Lions are going to face either the Rams, the Packers, the Steelers, the Seahawks, or the Vikings. And I'm wearing the Dallas Cowboys Thanksgiving. We don't need to go into their domination, although there was history made. Deron Bland, guy who it's an amazing football life and football story. He's got, the league lead for interceptions, and he's broken the record for most pick sixes in the year with 5. And honestly, I thought Jim Nantz gave one of the best calls I've heard this year for sure, but in a while, about, it being history being made. But I want to get to the Thursday game between Dallas and Seattle, a big game. The Cowboys have opened up as 8.5-point favorites, Seth. We'll start with that. Do you think the Cowboys can cover the 8.5 spread at home, a game where they've won 13 games at home? Their next home game is against the Philadelphia Eagles, too. So they want to make sure that they keep that streak going, at least for another week. But Seattle needing to play better football. We'll just start quickly. A couple points that we'll make. Do they cover that 8.5-point spread, which is what the line opened up at?
Yeah, if I had it my way, I would try and shave some of those points off if I could. But that's not the question here. We're going with what you asked me. And I'm going to actually say yes, because I do think there's a lot of, I think Seattle's banged up. I think that's kind of the reality of the Seahawks offense right now. I don't think Geno Smith is 100%. I don't know if Kenneth Walker is playing. He's currently questionable, but he's not practicing. I don't think DK Metcalf's 100%. So I do think there's a lot of,
and Tyler Lockett's been banged up for a while too.
Tyler Lockett also, thank you. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of injuries in Seattle that is starting to really creep into their season and become a bigger storyline for, you're talking about them or me saying or suggesting that they were locked into the playoff spot. And maybe now with their coming matchups, I'm starting to doubt that, right? Especially with some of the injuries that I'm seeing on this team. I do think that this is, and I'm going to preface this because Dallas at home, their offense it seems like they're almost always putting up 30 plus points. I do think this is the best defense they're going up against at home in the matchups that they've played. I think Devin Witherspoon is an absolute animal. We talked about him in a previous episode. And I just think they have a lot of talent around the ball there, in all layers or all levels of their defense. But this Dallas Cowboys team, especially at home, I used the word a few episodes ago, and I'm going to use it again. They overwhelm their opponents, and the fact that, they've got score makers on every side of the ball. You've got Tony Pollard who can put one in, even though he hasn't really had that success this year. You expect him to have a lot more touchdowns at this point, but we saw it against Washington. He still has that ability. CeeDee Lamb, Brandon Cooks, Jake Ferguson, all these guys who can make plays and score. And then also Deron Bland is someone who could score at any moment in any game too, it feels like. So I think the Dallas Cowboys are a very complete team. I think Brandon Cook starting to play to the expectation of what Dallas did in bringing him in here makes your team a lot scarier. And I think 8.5, although that might seem a little large, I probably prefer 6.5. I think Dallas can take away, especially later as this game goes on. I think they're going to start pulling away.
Well, I agree with everything you said. And I think for the Cowboys, from what I've been seeing last month, Dak Prescott's playing some of the best football I've seen him play. He's actually going to be a father-to-be. He talked about it being this, kind of dad strength that he's been using over the last little while, but he's been on fire. But I want to get through a couple quick player props. You talked about Devin Witherspoon. He's probably going to be on number 88, CeeDee Lamb, who got another touchdown, actually scored a more impressive 2-point conversion after that touchdown. His total set at 83.5, and I'll go with DK Metcalf as well, 57.5. I think that the under on CeeDee Lamb and the over on DK Metcalf. I think Devin Witherspoon. I think the Cowboys are going to spread the ball around a little more. This is the 23rd ranked pass defense in the league. I think CeeDee Lamb gets close to that 80 mark. I think maybe he finishes with a touchdown. But my question is under or over 83.5. We did a player props last week. We went 2 for 3 in our Thursday night picks. So those two receivers, 57.5 for DK, 83.5 for CeeDee Lamb. Where do you reside on those two guys?
I think I'm going to go the opposite of you. I think I'm going to go over on CD and under on DK Metcalf.
Okay.
I think this is going to be Devin Witherspoon's biggest test. I think it's one of the best receivers he'll be going up against.
Mm-hmm.
I think CeeDee Lamb is such an integral part of the offense in Dallas. And, you had mentioned that there was a few weeks ago, Jerry Jones was like, we need to spread the ball more. And ever since then, they've only been going to CeeDee Lamb more, it feels like. The chemistry he has with Dak Prescott, like if I expect Dak Prescott to have a good game, I'm expecting CeeDee Lamb to have a good game. That's kind of just the equation. And I think CeeDee Lamb is going to be spread like across the field. You're going to put him in the slot. You're going to put him on both sides. Witherspoon's not always going to be on him. And there's a little bit, we talked about the cracks in the offense in Seattle. I mean, they just last week benched Tyreek Woolen, who a year ago was had an incredible rookie season. So their secondary isn't stout. And we saw that, San Fran took full advantage of that. We saw, Brock Purdy was able to, they were very just, they spread that ball out, and McCaffrey obviously had a huge game. But I do think that Dak will be able to spread the ball out, and that might go against, the CeeDee Lamb over, but I think he's gonna hit it.
Okay. Quarterback props, a couple more here. Geno Smith, over under 226.5, and Dak Prescott over and under 280.5. I'm going to take the under in both of these. I think Geno Smith is going to be a little overwhelmed. There is the chance that if they're down by a lot, they just have to start throwing. But I think that there's a good chance for the under, and I think Dak Prescott, though he had a great performance against Washington, I think there is a bit of a tougher challenge against Seattle. It's a short week for both of them. Well, not really, but they both played on Thursday. But I'm going with the unders on both of those.
Yeah, I will. I'll follow suit. I do think Geno could. Again, you mentioned that if they're down,
26.5, right?
Yeah. I'm going to take the under on both.
Yeah, and I want to take that too. And I think that for the Cowboys, you look at some of the other props and you look at what else they can do. In terms of getting other players involved. You talked about Tony Pollard, Seth. I think that it's definitely going to be interesting. He's at 61.5. He really hasn't played up to his caliber, as you mentioned. Rico Dowell is not even on the board right now. But you could actually take right now at minus 115 on Bet365 CeeDee Lamb over 1.5 yards of rushing props. So I think that is very interesting. I think that this is obviously a bigger game for Seattle, but this is a big game for Dallas because they've got a tough schedule going down the road. They've got the Eagles, they've got the Dolphins, they've got the Bills, but they've got, what will be 3 games at home after beating Washington, thanks, in large part to Dolly Parton, who's still kicking ass and taking names and just dominating the halftime performance show in Arlington, Texas. Now you've got Seattle, who, these two teams have had history. And we brought it up last week, or a couple weeks ago, the Tony Romo botch snap in Seattle. I'll always not forget it. Actually, our mom is a big Seahawks fan, so I know I'll have some animosity towards her on Thursday. And our dad, I should say, who's a Dallas Cowboys fan, is also going to be watching this. But then they've got the Eagles coming up. And this is a big game because if the Cowboys win against Seattle and the Eagles drop the game to San Francisco, then it comes down to that Week 14 game. And the winner could be the team that ends up ultimately getting a bye in the NFC. I know they've got the Bills and the Dolphins and the Lions. They're starting their gauntlet, and then they end up at Washington, which is always a weird and funky game at the end of the year. They did it last year, and they cost me a lot of money. I'll just say that. But I think it's a big game for the Cowboys, and I think that you use the word overwhelmed and what they do defensively. I think that Micah Parsons back into the conversation. I know Myles Garrett's day to day. We'll see how he progresses, but if Micah Parsons has a couple big games, this down the stretch against these really tough opponents. I mean, you look at the leaders in sacks, and he's right up there. I mean, right now it's Danielle Hunter and T.J. Watt, but then you got Micah Parsons, who's just 2 sacks behind them. Deron Bland, again, leading the league in interceptions and pick sixes. So it's going to be an interesting Thursday nighter. I honestly think that the Cowboys do cover the spread as well. But Seth, we're reaching that moment in the day, or in the podcast, I should say, where we get to our 2-minute warning. I teased it a little bit earlier, so I'm going to be one setting this up. We've been talking about this for a couple weeks, off air, on air, but I think it needs to go to being said of what these 2 guys have been doing in Christian McCaffrey and Tyreek Hill. And you look at the league, Christian McCaffrey leads the league in rushing yards with 939, and he is tied for second with 11 touchdowns rushing. He also has, and I'm just going to get the stat here, 5 touchdowns receiving. Tyreek Hill leads the league with 1,324 receiving yards and 10 receiving touchdowns. So, Seth, I'm going to throw it to you, but here's our 2-minute warning question. Who is the better offensive weapon, and who is the more important player to that team? Is it Tyreek Hill in Miami or Christian McCaffrey in San Francisco?
Yeah, Sam, I'm going to say that I believe Christian McCaffrey is a more integral player to their offense. And I think we saw a very different San Francisco 49ers team once they made that move for Christian McCaffrey. It almost, you kind of just saw what Kyle Shanahan was trying to accomplish with this offense when they brought in a running back who could do everything, and he does everything. And, there's even games where he can catch, run, and throw a touchdown. Like they really use him in such unique ways, and it opens up everything. It allows George Kittle to be more of a threat. It allows Deebo Samuel, when you give him the ball, he's now, it's such a change of pace that it's harder to bring him down. Brandon Ayuk is able to do a lot more things. Brock Purdy's able to look as good as he is. So I think Christian McCaffrey, what we're seeing, his ability to, break tackles is probably one of the best in the league, in my opinion, because of how shifty he is. He's such a hard guy to bring down. He finds the end zone frequently, which is just a huge asset and a huge, for a quarterback and an offensive coordinator, when you're calling those plays, it's just a huge confidence booster to have that. And we're seeing this San Francisco 49ers, whose identity is their defense and has been for a long time, have one of the most explosive offenses. And I do think that is in large part because of what Christian McCaffrey has been able to do for them as a piece in that system.
Look, I'm not taking anything away from Christian McCaffrey. He's had an incredible year. But to me, the question is, who's the better offensive weapon and more important to the team? And I think that's Tyreek Hill without a doubt. You take Christian McCaffrey out of San Fran, they could still run Eli Mitchell, maybe not as efficiently. They still have Deebo Samuel. He had a rushing touchdown against Seattle last week. Tyreek Hill out of the equation. We saw it on Hard Knocks when Mike McDowell goes, do we have Tyreek? Do we have Reich? When he was out for a moment, hurting his hand against the Raiders, and then willed it with a little bit of a brace or some sort of thing on his hand, and he was still able to catch balls. They rely on him so much, and it's a multitude of ways. He drives 2 defenders away from him because he's usually double covered, or you see plays where he can just cut through the defenders, and with his speed. And speed is the name of the game. McCaffrey's got great speed, and I saw a photo or a video of McCaffrey on the sidelines getting his helmet screwed in, and the caption was reading, So he is a robot, right? Because he just seems like he's just robotic and he just does what he needs to do. But Tyreek Hill, you take him out of Miami and there's Jalen Waddle, but they've got no touchdowns from their tight ends. Mozart and Devon Achane are great, but he is the catalyst for everything. Tua's actually been putting him in good positions to catch balls. We saw an amazing touchdown against the Jets where he put it in his basket, but Tyreek, his ability to get around defenders, you can't play man against him. You can't even play coverage against him because he'll read the zone and he'll just come on a crossing route. And next thing you know, he's going down the sidelines for a 75-yard touchdown. In San Fran, they have a great offensive line. And I know McCaffrey comes out, but the motions that they're able to do in Miami to bring him in and move him out, it's very tough for defenses to game plan for both of them. But I think what Tyreek's going to do, I mean, we've seen really good running backs. LT's had amazing years. Sean Alexander, we've seen guys with big touchdown performing years. We've never seen a receiver get to 2,000 yards. And he's on the precipice of doing it. I'm not saying he will do it, but at 1,324 yards just after the Thanksgiving game, I really believe that Tyreek Hill is my offensive player of the year. And they may get the trophy together, but he's also the more important player to his roster.
Look, the reality is these are two incredible players who are both they're both integral to their offense. That's obviously a moot point, but I do very much agree with you that Tyreek Hill, or Reich as they call him on Hard Knocks in the Miami Dolphins locker room, what he's doing this year, what that offense has looked like since they brought him in has been nothing short but amazing. And it'll be fun to see how the rest of this week shapes up, how the rest of the season shapes up. There's constantly every week more storylines to be discussed, more to talk about on this podcast, and I love doing it with you week in and week out. So after further review, that's the Ruling on the Field podcast. Signing off. Sam, do you have any final words?
I'm just ready for another Cowboys win on Thursday and ready for some more great games like the Bills-Eagles. We need more of those really good back and forth type of games.
Yeah, you love to see it, and we'll talk about it all next week.